Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Tuesday, June 23rd, 2015. We're getting into the week here. We got a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And before we get into the news here, yesterday I opened the show talking about how I'd found this old VIC-20 computer, and I was joking. It's the only computer in my home that I know the NSA doesn't have a backdoor into. And I actually got a lot of email from listeners who had fond memories of the VIC-20, small, little, elegant machine. You could understand going on, everything going on inside it. And like this one here, they seem to all still be running 35 years after they were made. And I even got an email from a listener who didn't have a VIC-20 but still had his VIC-20 monitor. He's going to ship that to me so I don't have to jury-rig around all the wiring to get around the fact that modern TVs are not set up to receive over-the-air broadcast Channel 3 anymore. So a lot of people are having fun with that, fond memories with these very simple, elegant computers that we used to have, as opposed to these complex, corporatized, bloated monstrosities that we have now that are full of all of these things that work against us and for the government here. Now, I want to spend some time this morning on this nonsense about the Confederate flag. Everybody's all over there on the flag. It's time to remove the flag. We've got to take that Confederate flag down. And they're out there screaming that it's a symbol for racism, it's a symbol for hate, we've got to get rid of this thing. And to quote George Carlin, generally I leave symbols to the symbol-minded, but they are cranking up on this. A lot of people, and you even heard it on the SRN Newsbreak, a lot of people are opposed to this because for them the flag is not racism, it's family history. And they're not ready to basically be told that their family history is irrelevant and needs to be erased. A lot of people are upset about that. It's becoming a major, major controversy. Now, already we're seeing corporate America and the government jump on board this whole thing. Walmart, Amazon, and eBay, as of today, are going to ban all merchandise that carries the Confederate flag or variations thereof. And they're trying to ban this symbol of history so that we don't think about it anymore. Now, there's already a call for a boycott against these stores for basically violating the First Amendment right to freedom of expression, which certainly the display of that flag is going to be. So far, however, eBay has not canceled these campaign pins for Hillary Clinton from 2008 that feature the Confederate flag. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy. Oh, the flag is bad, the flag is bad. Except when a candidate's using it, then it's okay, it's cool. Rand Paul is out there joining the politically correct fanatics. The Confederate flag must come down. Rand Paul has declared it's a symbol of murder. Well, yeah, and under that same standard, we should ban the United States flag because it's a symbol of murder, especially in all those countries where the drone strikes are taking place. Now, the Confederate flag is not a symbol of racism, unless somebody declares it to be. I see the flag as a symbol of racism. The Confederate flag came into being as a symbol of self-determination of a people. It came into being as a symbol for the right of a people to secede. It is a reminder that the states that broke away from the British Empire should have recognized one another's right to break away from each other. And I think that's the real agenda behind banning this flag. The government doesn't want you thinking back to a time when a big chunk of the country decided they'd had enough with Washington, D.C., and were going to go their own separate way, just like Crimea did. But everybody's out there saying, racism, racism. Yeah, this flag flew above examples of racism. Well, again, the flag of the United States of America, the stars and stripes, flew in the skies during the Jim Crow laws period. It flew in the air during the locking up of Japanese in internment camps in California during World War II. It flies above the graves of innocent civilians in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. If we're going to ban a flag as a symbol of hate, fair is fair is fair. Sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. Now, I'm not advocating this because there's still a part of me deep inside that wants to feel pride in the Stars and Stripes. I don't right now. I'll be very honest about it. But I'd like to see that flag restored to being the symbol of freedom, justice, prosperity, and peace for all the people of the world. It's been hijacked and turned into the symbol of something very dark and ugly. And I'm very concerned that if this war agenda moves forward, 50 years from now, the world will look on the Stars and Stripes with the same revulsion our generation looks on the swastika. And I'd like to not see that happen. Now, the agenda to turn this into some kind of a race issue is proceeding apace, and apparently there is this group that was quoted over here in Sputnik News saying that we don't agree with what Dylann Roof did at the church, but his motives are not entirely without merit. And they're saying the problem is that our media and government focus on white on black crime and they don't focus on black on white crime, which sadly is true because they're pushing this political agenda of racism and they don't report when blacks commit crimes against white. That being said, the way this is phrased, it looks like a propaganda piece because somebody somewhere still wants race riots across the country so they can declare martial law and shred what's left of the Constitution. Now, here's an interesting little image taking place. The White House is refusing to back the head of the FBI in declaring that the shooting at the Charleston church was an act of terror. And I have this image in my mind over at the Oval Office of the president screaming, no, the shooting was racism. And the FBI says, no, it's terrorism. And Karl Rove is out there saying, no, this is proof we've got to ban guns. And they get into a fist fight, and they're rolling around on the floor of the Oval Office saying, my agenda, my agenda, my agenda. It's kind of a funny image if you think about it. All right, we're going to grab a real quick phone call here. Andrew in New York, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. What I'm trying to say is, like, a lot of these groups, like the Ku Klux Klan and many neo-Nazis have, like, government agent provocateurs. And, like,
absolutely.
They're trying to denigrate the people who are, like, against the government, like me and you, like, who don't believe what the government tells them. And, like, they're trying to find one way, like, they could, like, blame us for what happened.
Oh, there was already one article that I caught in the corporate media saying that this Dylann Roof was motivated to take this action because he'd been reading those online blogs and all the hate messages in the independent media. Bad internet, no cookie.
Yeah, that's true. I've been reading articles about how, like, it's been found out that the Sandy Hook shooting was staged and, like, there were multiple shooters involved in the shooting.
Yeah, it was an empty school. It wasn't even used. It was used as a stage set. All the families of the victims got their mortgages paid off. I mean, it's a repeating pattern. It's a repeating pattern. And it amazes me that they keep on trying it because, again, the life expectancy of these government hoaxes these days in the age of the Internet can be clocked with an egg timer.
All right, thanks, man.
All right, thanks. We're going to let you go here. Coming up here on our first commercial break, when we come back, we're going to go back to this issue about racism and just how silly they're getting. I have an example of just how silly the politically correct people are getting with all this racism nonsense. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And this politically correct focus on racism, because that's what all the candidates are going to be campaigning on next year. Don't want to talk about the economy, don't want to talk about the wars. They need an issue that they can get behind that doesn't challenge the status quo. Ooh, we've got race problems in this country. That's why they're trying to fan this stuff up, and they did it before, back in the 1960s. The FBI intentionally fanned up racial tension to keep the American people divided against each other at a time when most Americans wanted to unite against the war in Vietnam. It was called Operation COINTELPRO. You can do a web search on that. So anyway, we're getting this story that apparently the new Steven Spielberg movie Jurassic World has been accused of racism over the name given to one of the dinosaurs. Now, first of all, Spielberg didn't name the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are named by the discoverer of that particular fossil species. And one of the dinosaurs they have animated in the movie is called Pachycephalosaurus. So far, so good. There is a line in the movie, the Pachy's are out of containment. And apparently corporate media outlets and Twitter shills are saying this proves the film is racist. I cannot even begin to imagine how they got there. This is either extremely silly or it's a publicity stunt by Spielberg to get more people to see that movie. And Hollywood does this stuff all the time. Remember when the first part of the Star Wars Nineology came out? And they had a character called Jar Jar Binks. And everybody said, oh, that's racist. He's obviously a caricature of black Southern culture, blah, 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 blah. And that was a PR stunt because the movie wasn't doing as well as Lucasfilm wanted it to do. And sometimes these things do get a little out of hand. Many, many years ago, Walt Disney did a movie called Song of the South, which when it came out was well received. Musical, and basically it was a telling of stories and folk tales from the American South during the antebellum era. And then as everybody started getting to this racism, oh, Song of the South is racism, which is why you never see it again. And it's worth seeing within its historical context. We have way too many people running around this country whose entire sense of self-worth is based on always finding something to be offended about and then using that offense to deny that, whatever it is, to everybody else. Song of the South got censored by the politically correct people. Just like they're trying to censor the Confederate flag. It's not a symbol of racism, it's a symbol of independence from Washington, D.C., and that's why they want it to go away. Over at the protests of Occupy Wall Street and everything, people who are flying the Gadsden flag get harassed by the police. We can't have symbols of breaking away from abuse of authority. We don't do that in the United States of America. Yeah, we do. That's why we are the United States of America and not a British colony. Now, I want to step back a day here to a comment that came out of the Pope, who all of a sudden seems to have opted on to all the politically correct agendas. He's, global warming is a dangerous thing, and his most recent one was a statement that people who manufacture weapons or invest in weapons industries cannot call themselves Christian. This from his Popeness himself. It turns out the Vatican Bank is the main shareholder in Beretta Arms. So I think we have an answer to that age-old question, is the Pope Catholic? Because by his own statement, he's not even a Christian. It is amazing the hypocrisies that are out there. Vatican has another big scandal on its hand. We'll get to that much later in the day. It's down at the bottom of the talking points list here. Now, yet another horrible video has surfaced, supposedly from ISIS, produced with very expensive professional quality production gear, and of course discovered by Rita Katz and Site Intelligence Group. In this one, some guys are put in a cage, the cage is put into a pool, and they drown, and they have underwater cameras to record all of the horror. It's a waste of time to even look at it. This is another production from Rita Katz and Site Intelligence Group. So, I'm going to have a little spoiler here and tell you the next several videos that we can expect to see out of Rita Katz and Site Intelligence Groups. We're going to have a video of ISIS clubbing baby seals. ISIS operating lemonade stands without a permit. ISIS refuses to recycle. And ISIS farts in elevators because they are evil, evil people, and you should hate them. Now, as you know, the United Nations came out with their report on war crimes committed during last summer's flattening of Gaza by Israel. Israel's trying to get ahead of this thing. They're trying to get people to ignore it. They're out there trying to say, well, there were equal amounts of war crimes committed on both sides. And the American corporate media is echoing that last one, and it is flat out not true. Now, the UN Human Rights Council documented all of the incidents committed by both sides. There's no question. Far worse, far more numerous war crimes were committed by Israel, and worse, the United Nations Human Rights Council says on Israel's side, they were deliberate policy, ordered from the highest levels of Israel's government. Israel, of course, is out there screaming that the United Nations is biased, they're anti-Semites, and they're already out there lobbying, trying to get more Israelis onto the Human Rights Commission so that it will be fair and balanced in the future here. But let's look at the numbers. 2,251 Palestinians were killed, including 1,462 civilians, 551 children. 6 civilians died in Israel. That's how lopsided it was, because the people of Gaza, all they've got are home-built rockets. Israel has the latest and greatest in U.S. taxpayer-paid-for modern weaponry. This idea that the crimes and the force was equal on both sides is complete and utter nonsense. And we need to remember, Israel launched that war onto Gaza on the basis of a very dubious accusation that Hamas had kidnapped 3 teenagers over in the West Bank, and the West Bank police say, no, that's not what the evidence indicates. So Israel's out there screaming that there's got to be balance. It's not balanced. It was never a balanced situation. It was an overwhelming, devastating, collective punishment of all the people of Gaza. And all of Israel's whining is not going to hide that. We'll be back. We've got a phone call waiting. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Israel and Palestine and the United Nations report on the war crimes committed during Israel's assault on Gaza last year. And the UN's conclusion that the war crimes were intentional, ordered by high-ranking members of Israel's government. Needless to say, the Palestinians, in a rare display of unity among the various factions, are now on their way to the International Criminal Court to press for prosecutions against those high-ranking individuals. And what we can pretty much guarantee now, based on Israel's past behavior, is they will uncork collective punishment all across Palestine for daring to charge Israel's leadership at the ICC. You're not allowed to do that. We are above the law, don't you understand? We're going to grab ourselves a phone call here. Glenn in Pennsylvania. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. ISIS has already posted an aquatic sequel in which the cage doors are open and the victims are eaten by sharks with lasers on their heads.
I love it. You know, we got to do more of this, okay? The best way to undermine this propaganda campaign is to make as much fun of it as we can. You know, I was trying to come up with a graphic for ISIS tears the tags off of couch cushions and, all the rest of it. Yeah, we got to just make as much fun. ISIS does this, ISIS does that. You know, ISIS is stealing socks out of your dryer. I can come up with a graphic for that one.
Get right, Hank. Oh, by the way, we did see Song of the South again, Mike, in the movie sequel Fletch Lives with Chevy Chase when he inherited his aunt's plantation called Delisle.
Yeah.
Remember that it did the whole zippity-doo-dah thing? It was a whole big music thing. They had cartoon dogs and birds in it. And
they had an excerpt in there. They had an excerpt in there. And again, when it first came out, it was, it was a hit. It was a major hit.
Right.
But
the Chevy Chase thing is hilarious. They're just amazing.
Yes, it is.
That's like Colonel Sanders. But anyway.
Oh, boy. By the way, have you seen the new reincarnation of Colonel Sanders? I mean, it gives me chills looking at him. I don't know. It's either a robot or it's a really skinny guy with a lot of makeup on him.
almost as bad as that Burger King weirdo, puppet guy, the costume guy. That's the weirdest. Anyway.
Yeah, where all these people screaming racism and everything, why aren't they going after Kentucky Fried Chicken?
Yeah, exactly.
Colonel Sanders here, I put chicken in the lemonade.
Yeah, well, Colonel Sanders probably come down with the bird flu anyway.
All right, thanks an awful lot. Bye-bye. All righty, yes, Colonel Sanders dead of the bird flu at age 122, or whatever he would actually be here. All righty, getting on back to Israel. And remember what I said before about Israel's going to throw a tantrum and just start carrying out attacks against the Palestinians as punishment for daring to try and charge Israel's leaders at the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And by the way, by virtue of the fact of Israel's membership at the United Nations, Israel's leadership effectively agrees to be bound by international law and prosecuted for war crimes. And, of course, their attitude is, no, the rules don't apply to us. We're Israel. Don't you understand? So over in Nablus, apparently Israeli settlers went on a rampage and chopped down more than 70 olive trees growing between the towns of Yasuf and Jemain in the northern West Bank district of Selfit and Nablus. And the Palestinian farmers said that basically the settlers were able to do what they did because they come into the farmlands on the settler-only roads, tear down the trees, and then flee afterwards. Now, remember, those settler roads are segregated. The Israelis are allowed to use them. By the way, a lot of them are built at U.S. taxpayer expense. The Palestinians are simply blocked from entering. Makes a really easy mechanism for the Israelis to come on in, chop down a tree, and then skedaddle. And you need to remember, it takes 10 years of growth before an olive tree produces a usable crop. And very clearly, this is just the Israeli settlers trying to destroy the economy of the Palestinian territories to drive them out so they can take the place over. Now, the latest Gaza Freedom Flotilla is underway. The Marian of Gothenburg is a Scandinavian fishing boat. It has departed Sweden, and it is currently in Messina, Italy, where it's being greeted by peace activists and loaded up with food, medicines, and solar panels. And they're going to be sailing to Gaza to break the Gaza blockade. Israel has already announced under no circumstances will food, medicine, and solar panels be allowed to enter Gaza, and they will intercept the ship. And they're saying it's okay for them to do it this time because they've already apologized for the Mavi Marmara, therefore the slate is clean and they can go ahead and abuse another humanitarian aid mission. Now, one of the passengers on this aid flotilla is an Arab member of the Knesset. Marev Ben Ari has Basil Gattas is participating in the Gaza flotilla, and another member of the Knesset, Marev Ben Ari Kulano, is requesting a special Knesset session in which they're going to say, we're just going to kick this guy out. You can't be a member of the Knesset and not toe the official line on all of this stuff. And they're getting desperate out there, okay? The owner of the New England Patriots, Robert Kraft, has taken a delegation of 20 former NFL players, some of them from the Hall of Fame, to Israel to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu, to turn them into lobbyists against the Iran P5+1 deal. And Netanyahu is getting desperate if he's down to using sports stars for his endorsements. Yes, this guy who can really throw a football says the Iran deal is bad for America. Now, the other day we were talking about how the Geneva talks about peace in Yemen accomplished absolutely nothing, to be followed immediately by more Saudi bombing of Yemen civilians. And there's a story that came out over in Global Research saying that basically U.S.-supported elements in Geneva sabotaged the talks. It basically came down to a demand from U.S. interests that U.S. puppet ruler Hadi be reinstated as the head of state. And that is the only thing that will halt the bombing. I've been telling you all along. This is about punishing the people of Yemen for wanting to take back their country from foreign puppet rule. And that's what this bombing of Yemen is all about. It's collective punishment for refusing to be slaves. Now, they're trying to put a positive spin on what's going on in Yemen. Remember, yesterday it turned out the Yemenites captured 3 Saudi military bases. And that looks really bad. So today, of course, we get the inevitable report, a top al-Qaeda leader killed in Yemen by a suspected U.S. drone strike. Well, there aren't too many other people in there with drones. Now, when PBS NewsHour reported this story yesterday, all the United States would say is this was a person of interest. Today, he's a top al-Qaeda leader. Yesterday, he was merely a person of interest. They didn't know he actually had done anything wrong. They were just curious about him, and that apparently is enough justification to blow him and 20 or 30 people around him into bloody, ragged bits. So they can say, we got a top al-Qaeda leader. Are we not butch and great and heroic? We'll be right back after these commercials. Hi, America. Welcome back to our show today. Now, over in Russia, things are heating up. Everybody's putting all their toys out there on the front line and sneering at each other. The U.S. wants a war with Russia so bad they can taste it, the blood at least, in their mouth. They want a war. As long as your kids get to go fight it, of course. They're not going to fight this war themselves. You know, they want your kids to go fight against Russia because, after all, that's what you're for. It's the only reason to allow you to have kids is to be future workers and future soldiers. So we're looking at this story out of Russia today. The U.S. is deploying 250 heavy military vehicles, including Abrams tanks, near the Russian border. But remember, this is all Russia's provocation. This is all Putin making this all happen here. And basically they're saying we're sending a message to Moscow. In global terms, Russia is no match conventionally to the U.S. or NATO. I'm not entirely sure I would buy that one, because it's coming from the same people who told you Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. Yes, the U.S. has huge amounts of military hardware, but don't forget, we're on the tail end of 13 years of constant warfare across the globe. And warfare is very rough on the weapons. They get used up. A lot of the tanks that were sent into Iraq, the engines are destroyed by sand that gets in there. The very expensive, lowest bidder sand filter really didn't work. The stuff isn't really built to last. And American stockpiles are drawn down. I don't think the U.S. can win a conventional war against Russia and China. And remember, every war starts with both sides thinking they're going to win, which means half the time somebody's wrong. And the propaganda is really cranking up. It's really out of control. Over at Politico.com, I am not kidding you, they had a headline story, Putin's plot to get Texas to secede. They're out there trying to sell the idea that Russia has infiltrated Texas and they're supporting and arming and funding the secession movement. So anybody in Texas talking about seceding from the United States of America, they're working for the evil Russians and you shouldn't listen to them at all. Anyway. Now, the other day we ran this story where Poroshenko admitted that Yanukovych was removed in a coup d'etat. It wasn't a popular rebellion. It wasn't democracy. It was a coup d'etat. And he admitted that. Now, this was in an interview which BBC then edited for airing. And here's where BBC really kind of got weird, because, BBC was interviewing Yanukovych for his side of the story. And Yanukovych basically came out saying that the reason Crimea decided to break away from Ukraine and join Russia was because they were shocked at the violence of the coup. that ousted the former government. BBC cut this out, saying it wasn't really newsworthy for Yanukovych to say Crimea voluntarily left Ukraine, and BBC spent most of the interview talking about Yanukovych's personal zoo where he's got some pet ostriches. And that was what BBC thought the British people wanted to hear about, not the fact that Crimea was not in fact conquered and annexed by Russia. Russia's out there saying that they are not eager for any kind of a reset of relations with the U.S. This is being spun as provocative on the part of Russia, but Russia's basically saying, look, you broke this relationship. You broke the friendship. It's up to you to mend it. And at this point, they've already written off the next year and a half of the Obama presidency as being completely unproductive. We're going to grab a phone call here. Scott in Texas. Aloha, Scott. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, you had a comment made where they were talking about Russians wanting to help Texans to succeed. Well, we don't really need their help. We've been trying for a long time.
Well, you know, I'm sure they're going to scream that the Russians are in here in Hawaii supporting our sovereignty independence movement, and every other state with an independence movement, which is Alaska, pretty much the western half of the United States. You know, it's a very weak piece of propaganda, but they're trying to figure some way to get everybody to hate the Russians and to hate anybody who even has any sympathy with the Russian or rest of the world's point of view relative to U.S. hegemony.
Well, the thing is, if anybody really kind of studies Russia, kind of just, you know, from their own point, you know, and start kind of looking into it, I mean, Russia or Putin, I mean, if you put Putin and Obama side by side, I guarantee you most people would pick Putin right off the bat just because.
Well, you know, there's a very funny quote going around, supposedly Putin observing about Obama being a strutting pigeon. It's a hoax quote, but it actually sounds really good. And you know what's really ironic here? With everybody screaming about the flag of the Confederacy and how horrible and all the rest of that, it is an interesting fact that Russia came to the aid of Lincoln during the Civil War because all of the European nations backed the Confederacy in order to destroy Lincoln's greenback, because Lincoln refused to borrow from private bankers to fund the Northern War. He exercised his authority as president and issued a government debt-free currency, and the bankers of Europe said, this has to be destroyed. This has to be erased from the face of the earth. We can't let the people enslaved to private central banking see that a government-issued currency actually works better for the nation. And they actually funded and supported the Confederacy until the Union blockade took hold. And France and Britain seriously considered invading Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Confederacy. They were held at bay by Russia that deployed warships to both coasts of the United States of America to prevent that from happening. Little bit of history they don't teach in the public schools.
Yeah, I know, and that's the thing. I mean, everybody has to get educated once they get out of school because it's just an indoctrination in school.
Oh, that's what, you know, school got in the way of my education. You know, I did not have a happy time with my teachers.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've learned more in the past 4 years than I have probably in 20. So it's just pretty scary. I mean, thankfully the internet gives everybody the ability to do this, and people go out and start kind of reporting on their own and start waking everybody else up too. It's just an awakening. It's just, you know, we're fighting the Goliath here, and all the best people like you and other people, you know, are always broke. I mean, look at some of the greatest minds like Tesla, you know. They just keep all the good people down. And
yeah, you know, Brian Williams, after being proved a liar, gets hired back by NBC at $8 million a year. Okay? It's an insult to the American viewer that they hired him back at all. And if they were going to hire him back, put him on minimum wage. Let him see how he feels about the economy after that.
Well, like I say, it's just, these people are just getting away with everything, and the people are just going to, once we the people finally have enough, there's going to have to be something happen. I don't, you know, everybody, you know, don't want to go to war or anything with their own government, but you just don't see much changing until it comes down to a collapse, and then it's going to be that.
I got to make 2 points. We're almost out of time here. It's not our government anymore. Okay?
Right.
Washington, D.C. is not the government of we the people. It's the government of Wall Street. It's the government of the military-industrial complex. It's the government of Israel. It's the government of the money junkies. It's not our government. I see Washington, D.C. having violated the Constitution is illegal, illegitimate, unconstitutional. It's not our government. I don't call it my government. We don't have a legal, legitimate government in this country. I, at the same time, do not encourage any kind of war or violence because the government is prepared to deal with that harshly. But in a war for information, a war being fought with keyboards instead of machine guns, the government's at a disadvantage. They don't know how to deal with an educated, skeptical, and aware population. And that is why eventually they are going to collapse from the rot of their own corruption and lies, just like the former Soviet Union. I got to let you go, Scott. We got to take a break for the news, and we will be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645. We have 2 callers waiting on the line. I'm going to get to you in just a second. But I have a couple of stories I want to share about what's going on up in Ukraine. According to spokesman for the Donetsk Republic, Kiev forces violated the current ceasefire 31 times in the last 24 hours. Shelling settlements of Spartak, Yasuna Yataya, Kilanovka. I will admit up front, I don't speak Russian, so I'm having trouble with the names. Dokuchayevsk, Yelenovka, and also Kievsky, and I'm not even going to try that last one. But basically, Poroshenko is not abiding by the Minsk agreement. He's out there shelling the people and just committing war, and we are hearing that there is major dissension in the ranks of his own forces. We had that high official defected to Donetsk, said more are likely to follow. Kiev's military forces are absolutely upset that they're being ordered to kill their own countrymen. Apparently, in the southern Odessa region, there is a growing anti-Kiev sentiment there as well. They're starting to talk about seceding and breaking off and forming their own republic. This whole thing is just crumbling. And have you noticed the double standard of the money junkies? You know, they're going to crush Greece down into the dirt for not paying back their bills. Kiev can't pay their bills, and IMF is just shoveling even more money onto them so they can go on killing those pesky Eastern Ukrainian republics that don't want to be slaves to the European Central Bank. It's a very obvious hypocrisy and double standard. All right, we're going to grab a phone call. Matthew in Texas. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike? I got to start with this Brian Williams thing. As a veteran, it's never been accurately disgraced. Like, this guy is scum. As a military veteran, the worst thing that anybody can do is make up stories and, like, lie about their honor and stuff and what they've done. For this guy to do it, I mean, I don't know if it's a felony to lie about medals or whatever, or wear the jacket, but how is it not for him to do it in front of the whole country?
Yeah, I believe that there actually are laws against wearing military decorations you have not earned if you're in the military. If there are obvious decorations in civilian use, the law simply isn't enforced because there's a big memorabilia marketplace.
So this guy's wearing them like in front of everybody, and there's no physical stuff, but mentally he's wearing these awards. You know what I mean? I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, maybe he just fell into the trap of believing his own propaganda or his own publicity, which I've seen that happen in Hollywood many times when these big stars start believing their own press releases, and it is a recipe for disaster. And Brian Williams should have just had his career vanish at that point. Exactly.
And instead, MSNBC hires him back for only $8 million a year. You know, because he's a very gifted liar, and I think it was less about thinking that the audience is going to believe what Brian Williams has to say as trying to prove that the corporate media is still loyal to their paid liars even when the liars are exposed. And I think that was an important point for them to make, or they're going to start seeing more desertions or more people driven from their talking head jobs when they get outed on these lies. And what the corporate media is basically saying is, we know they lie, we know that you know they lie, we are going to keep them here anyway at huge multi-million-dollar paychecks, which is why the corporate media is losing their audience, and they're all coming on over here to the independent media, where we're operating on spare change that we can find under the seat cushion.
Well, I'll tell you, if that boy walked into a military bar and spouted that stuff off, he wouldn't walk out.
Well, that's probably why he doesn't hang out in military bars.
All right, let's move on to Garland. I actually went to Naaman High School. Now, this Garland thing that happened is literally right next to it. They built this in 2004, 2008. I don't know the exact date. But it's nonsense. I mean, two guys show up, and there's a hotel like 100 yards back where you could sit up 10 stories high and put up, you know, somebody with a rifle. Anything. You wouldn't go up and, like, this is not a military action. This is clearly somebody who has no training, and they're just propaganda. Like, because one person should have been up there trying to shoot. I mean, it's simple. It's just simple. Anybody who's seen Naaman Forest High School, Garland, this is not a place to attack. There's nothing there. It's just a big building.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. They're trying to have all these shootings. They're trying to build a case where Americans will say, oh, yes, please take away all the guns from the law-abiding citizens, and that will make sure the criminals never get them, which makes about as much sense as the claim that banning drugs for the law-abiding citizens has kept drugs out of the hands of the criminals. It doesn't work. It never has. But this government is absolutely terrified, afraid of the American people, because an armed populace was designed into this nation by the Founding Fathers as the last stand against tyranny in this nation. Congress has failed. They're little more than a rubber stamp on the White House. The Supreme Court is turning a blind eye to all the constitutional violations. All of the safeguards created by the Founding Fathers have been torn down except this last one, and that's why it's under attack. Because if the government can trick you out of your guns, next they're going to come for your gold and silver, your sons and daughters for their wars. They're going to come in and say, oh, because of global warming, you've got to live in a little tiny home that's built out of an old shipping container because the money junkies want much bigger lawns around their palaces.
That leads me to my next point. This manifesto that was put up, I mean, this sounds just like the Unabomber stuff. I mean, he was a CIA asset, wasn't he? I mean, how do you have this out there in February, they claim, and nobody noticed this? Where's the NSA on this? How many times did you use the N-word? I mean, there's so much racial... I don't know if you've read this 2,500 piece of crap wording document, but how do you not find this if you have the NSA and you're out there searching for all these hateful terms every day?
I actually posed that question on one of the news sites where this was, and one of the shills got on board and say, well, you know, this manifesto, there are so many just like it all over the country. I mean, reading this, we have no idea, and they're trying to make excuses for the fact, but frankly, I think this is as made up as this guy's Facebook page. Remember, he was not supposed to survive the shootout. Witnesses said he put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger, but he had run out of bullets. And so he was supposed to be conveniently dead so that there'd be nobody out there saying, oh, he didn't really write that manifesto, he didn't really set up the Facebook page. And it's just like all these other government hoaxes. It's already falling apart. It's only been a few days, and everybody is saying there are reasons to think this was another government-staged hoax.
I agree. I'm going to change topics here real quick.
Okay.
This is one of your least favorite. Ho Chi Minh Trail, Vietnam.
Yes.
This is where I kind of got my belief that chemtrails could exist, and now I'm kind of doubting it as I look at it. What were your perceptions of what happened in Vietnam? Were they successful in seeding clouds?
Okay, now I want to set aside the idea of the whole chemtrail meme, because that, like HAARP and fake Apollo moon landings and no planes to the Pentagon, is part of the poisoning the well junk that the government dumps all over the net. Now, that being said, there were efforts to try weather modification in Vietnam that didn't really work out very well. Most of what got sprayed on Vietnam was Agent Orange, and that has little to do with weather modification or chemtrails and everything to do with out-of-control cancer rates and massive birth defects.
So everything I've read said it wasn't really effective, and there's this corporation right now, I want to say it's Mary's, it doesn't matter. They're claiming that they've been seeding rainstorms in the desert. I mean, is this effective technology that could be used today? I mean, we have that thing in China where they came out and said, don't worry about the weather. I mean, does this really work? Is there any proof to this?
It can work under certain very specific circumstances. If you have rain clouds over a territory that are not raining, you can seed them with fine particulates for the raindrops to form around. Believe it or not, the Native Americans actually knew this, because when they would do the rain dance, you know, the popular image is, oh, they're just out there with their rattles and drums. No, they would take objects made of silver and toss them in the fire, because those silver oxide particles would travel up with the smoke and could actually trigger a downpour. So it actually did work. Okay, we got to take another break for commercials. I'm going to respond to your other question as soon as we come back from these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, with regard to cloud seeding, which is trying to get clouds to drop rain, it can work under certain very narrow atmospheric conditions. But there hasn't been a lot done with it because of the legal ramifications. There have actually been numerous lawsuits brought by farmers, counties that are downwind from where cloud seeding takes place, because if you're forcing the cloud to drop its rain in one area, it means it's not going to drop the rain where it might actually go. And there have been successful lawsuits suing cloud seeders for stealing the rain away from where nature would have sent it. There have also been a few lawsuits following floods that were triggered by cloud seeding. So it's a big legal mess. Now then, let's see. Going to grab another phone call here. Wally in Texas. Aloha, Wally. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi. Welcome to Wally World.
Hey. Get the moose antlers.
You know, I don't have a problem with Brian Williams because my television's very important to me. I use it to prop open the back door.
Good for you.
I mean, anybody that watches television, analytically, I can see why you do, and you know, because of your profession and the feedback, you know, I can see that, but whenever I discuss Patriot happenings with someone, the first thing I'll ask them is, do you watch and listen to mainstream news? And if they say yes, I say, well, we're already at a disadvantage here. But, you know, you need, and I'll throw some websites at them, and yours is the one I throw first, because, you know, you're more...
Okay, Wally, thank you for the kind words here, but I think you need to break that question into two parts. You can ask somebody, do you watch the corporate TV news? And if they say yes, then you ask the second question, do you believe them? Because a lot of people are watching the corporate news.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
that's very good.
And just say, remember, and just, if they say, oh yeah, I believe it, so, well, you know, they told you that Saddam had nuclear weapons. They told you the unemployment is down to 3%. They told you that there were torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin. Just go down the whole list of all the lies that are proven lies and just say, why are you trusting? They're owned by corporations. They're in the business of selling you stuff. This year's car, this year's running shoe, this year's candidate, this year's war. That's what they're in business to do. They're not paid to tell you the truth. The people who are out there telling the truth don't get paid a whole heck of a lot of money for it. You know, these big bucks are being paid to people like Brian Williams because they're very convincing liars.
I can't believe that they would pay someone that much money. Just unbelievable. But now here's the reason.
I can't tell you how much it annoys me that he gets that much money. And this is a pay cut. His pay has been lowered to $8 million a year. Ooh, let's all feel bad for poor Brian Williams. He has to make do on only $8 million a year. I can't even conceive of that kind of money.
I know. Okay, now here's what's really important that I need to get your feedback on, and that's this. Do you remember Cheney stating that any state that secedes from the United States will be nuked? Do you remember that?
I remember him saying that. Because even back during the Bush years, there were a lot of states that were out there saying, you know, it's time for a sovereignty movement. We've got several active independence groups here in Hawaii. They're all running on the fact that the U.S. government has admitted the original annexation of Hawaii was illegal and invalid. They feel really bad about it. They're not going to give the land back to the Hawaiian people, but they put on a frowny face. Same thing with Alaska. 3 different independence groups in Texas that I'm aware of, the Western States Coalition. There's a lot of unhappiness with the federal government out there, and yeah, back during Bush, these sovereignty movements were really cranking along. By now, I'm sure they've all been infiltrated by FBI informants in order to sow chaos and disrupt them. But yeah, Cheney did come out and say any state that thought of leaving Washington, D.C. was going to get nuked.
Okay, so you were concerning your earlier discussion about Putin and Texas seceding.
Mm-hmm.
Just a real simple question: where are we going? I'm in Texas. People, this is driving us further away. Common sense further away. This new international TPP, whatever the hell that was, agreement that they've signed, that's driving us further towards secession. Now, here's the question, the big question, why I called in to get your feedback on. Who are we going to use for muscle if it's not Putin?
Well, again, I think the question of muscle is largely irrelevant because I think the government in Washington, D.C., and Wall Street are going to collapse of their own crimes, corruption, internal rot the way the Soviet Union did. And if we just have the strength to be patient and not give the government an excuse to declare a national emergency and martial law, just kick on back, get a cold one and some popcorn and watch the show. I think that's what's going to happen in the long run.
Last question, Michael. Who do you respect more? I know the answer. Who do you respect more, Putin or Obama?
Well, Putin. Absolutely.
There you go. I never dreamed that I would say I'll take the Russian premier over my own president. I never thought it'd get that bad.
I know exactly how you feel because when I was a kid growing up in New Hampshire and we were being bombarded by all the propaganda about those gosh darn commies and, my grandfather was, very much into that. We've got to stop the commies and everything. And the idea that someday I would have grown up to have a great deal of respect for the leader of Russia, that I would be quoted in Pravda and TASS. I mean, my grandfather would be spinning in the grave, I think, except that as he got older, he got a little more aware globally, and he might actually have said, this government as it is today is not what I sacrificed a lung to mustard gas for in World War I. It's gone completely off the rails. In fact, my grandfather... My grandfather had this thing he used to say all the time. He says, the way you have good government in the United States of America, and remember, this is a guy who was drinking buddies with Richard Nixon. He said, you elect a politician. If they don't do what they promise they'll do and only what they promise they'll do, you shoot them. Then you elect another politician. If they don't do what they promise they'll do and only what they promise they'll do, you shoot them. Then you elect another politician, and the odds are they're going to do what they promise they're going to do and only what they promise they're going to do. And this was from, a guy who was a decorated veteran in World War I.
Impressive for sure. I'm very serious about this discussion today. I'm very focused on, what's your percentage of that happening? What, 50-50, 75-25?
It's only a matter of time here. That's why they're trying to start a war before the economy implodes, because then they got somebody to blame it on. Because if the economy melts down and they can't blame it on Russia and China, we, the American people, are going to say this is all Wall Street corruption and complicity by the federal government, and it's time for them to clean out their desks and give us back our capital city. Mark, I got to let you go here. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back with another phone call. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And first off, I want to apologize to the caller who was on hold to talk about Russia. I hit the wrong drop button. My bad. It's a hardware problem. Loose nut on the keyboard, and please call back in. Meanwhile, we have another caller waiting on the line. Let's see if I can get him plugged in without accidentally disconnecting him. Mark in North Carolina. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Mark, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. We've got gremlins in the phone system today. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I called both my senator's office here. North Carolina, today. Senator Richard Burr and Tom Tillis. And both of them evidently are going to vote for this horrible act tomorrow. They're going to betray the country. I told their stooges who answered, I said, you know what? Why don't they just spit on the graves of the soldiers who have died through the ages protecting this country? you can just throw away the country and destroy it and hurt the working people in this country and basically turn us into a globalist society. All right, I heard the girl giggling when I was telling her that. This was Burr's girl. By the way, this guy Burr is also the head of Intelligence Committee, and I think he was quoted at one time saying, "None of the people's business know what goes on in intelligence." The other thing is, I didn't, because I was remembering that, I also said, I bet you think Ed Snowden is a traitor. I said, the fact of the matter is he's a hero. And this time another guy comes on and says, no, Snowden is a traitor. He betrayed his oath. I said, no, his oath is to the Constitution and the people of this country, not to some governmental organization. You're the traitors. And the other thing is I wanted to tell you about is Mark Meadows, a congressman from my district where I live. This is a patriot. He called up. He actually called me. He voted against this thing. And you know what they did to him? Yeah. That guy from Utah, Jason Chapis.
Yes.
Leaves him up duties as far as whatever committee chairmanship he had in the Congress, and Chapis relieved him of those duties. Now,
it didn't just happen to him. Everybody who was against TPP has been stripped of their committee roles by the congressional leadership. They're literally punishing anybody who is not going along with this globalist agenda. Now, what they voted through today was to end debate. In other words, they didn't want to hear any more people get up there and say, this is bad for America, it's wrong for Congress to abandon its oversight role on treaties. And the Senate simply voted, we don't want to hear it anymore. We don't see it, we don't hear it, you can't make us, nya, 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 nya. They're going to vote on the actual fast-track authority tomorrow, which is basically Congress telling the President, you can do whatever you want. You are pre-approved. We are too busy chasing our interns and bowing and scraping to Israel to be concerned over this treaty that could ultimately destroy the economy of the United States of America. I think the reason there is such pressure to get these treaties through is the U.S. government understands the American economy is in decline, and what they want to do is lock global commerce into some kind of a permanent state through this treaty. In order to get the other countries to sign on, they're having to make concessions harmful to the American worker and the American economy, but it's a question of take a little loss now rather than a complete loss 5-10 years down the road. I think that's the reason there is so much pressure to get this through, why there is so much secrecy. They're literally selling out the American workers in the hope that they can get all these other countries to sign on to more long-term commitments to sustain the American economy, such as banning GMO and so forth. I think that's what's going on. It is still far from certain that the other countries are going to sign on to this thing, despite all the arm twisting and deal making and bribes and extortion that are going on behind the scenes.
Well, I think we need to make it clear to every one of them that they're going to be ex-congressmen or senators. The other thing, too,
I would take it one more step further. If Congress is not going to exercise their constitutional duty of oversight on the executive branch, then let's just empty out the building and turn it into public housing.
Well, I agree with you, but I mean, we're going to have to be able to do that. Maybe the military would overthrow them, but I doubt it. But what I think too is that I think they're just bought and paid for by these big corporations. And I think
that's exactly what's happened here. As soon as they were able to get those limits on campaign contributions taken off, especially under that ludicrous idea that corporations are legal persons, the Capitol building became a giant shopping mall for all the corrupting influences in our nation.
I just want people to know one other thing, too. This is the Republicans' baby, all right? And they're not doing it because they're trying to placate Obama. They want this. Only 5 Republicans, from what I understand, are going to vote against this thing. And I'll tell you who they are. Rand Paul. Ted Cruz changed. Now he's against it. The 2 senators from Alabama, Shelby and what's the guy's name? He's really been great on this.
I'm blanking on his name, too. But with regard to Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, with regard to Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, they are running for president next year, and they understand supporting this trade agreement is going to be a negative among the electorate, because by the time the election comes around, we're all going to know what's actually in these trade bills. And again, what they're voting on now is the fast-track authority, and Ted Cruz and Rand Paul can vote against it because it's not going to change the final ultimate outcome. And basically, it's going to pass whether they vote for it or not. So they're thinking in terms of being able to go to the primary season next year saying, well, I was against it, really. I tried to halt this reckless use of congressional authority, and it's all going to be posturing and speechifying.
Yeah, Rubio, by the way, is voting for it, too. So let people know. The other thing is about what Cruz, you could say with Cruz, he voted against it before he voted for it. So, that's a bunch of crap, too, as far as I'm concerned. I think the only, I tell you the truth, I don't know what the hope of this country is anymore. I don't know if a good president, strong president, could just say, you know what, he made the treaty, we're not going to obey it, it's unconstitutional. International bodies don't rule over the United States of America.
Well, the U.S. walks out of treaties all the time. They've walked out of the ABM treaty. They're in complete violation of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty with regard to Iran. The U.S. does not keep its treaty commitments unless the money junkies who are funding politicians say, oh, yes, this is a good deal. We've got to block GMO advertising. We've got to mandate vaccines. And it's all driven by the money power, which is why when this country was set up, they tried to put a very tiny little gate between the money and the politicians. And unfortunately, the money junkies over time have eroded the safeguards away to where the advantage has shifted away from we the people to the money junkies. Originally, there were strict limits on campaign contributions to candidates and donations, so the politicians' campaign war chest did represent a measure of their popular support. Once those limits were taken off, it's basically the politicians, they go to the big money providers on Wall Street to get their funds. Their raising of funds from ordinary voters is more for tradition and the sake of public appearances. But they don't really rely on that at all anymore. It's look at Hillary Clinton. She's out there talking about wanting to be the champion of the poor people, and look how much money she's taken in from all these big Wall Street firms. I mean, that's how open the corruption and hypocrisy has become.
We need to get rid of the WTO, too. We need to just say, no, you're not going to tell us what to do. We passed a law that we want to know the origin of that meat, and it needs to stay that way. You don't cater to international bodies. It goes against the Constitution. I don't know.
Yeah, it really does. It's transferring our sovereignty to these transnational, non-elected organizations. But for me, when I go to the supermarket, if that meat doesn't have a label saying where it's coming from, I'm just not going to buy it. Period. End of discussion. All right, we got to take a break for commercials, Mark. Thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go. We will be right back. Hello, hi, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, the Pentagon has just announced that they will be paying salaries to all of the moderate Syrian rebels fighting against President Assad. Now, actually, they've been doing that all along. They're just admitting it officially because too many people know the U.S. government has been funding these hired mercenaries trying to overthrow Assad. They're beginning to understand they can't get away with these lies and deceptions the way they used to back in the golden age of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s, when we, the people, would believe anything they told us. And all the government had to do was wag commies at us, and we would wet ourselves and fling our money and our babies into whatever war they wanted to do. Now, WikiLeaks is releasing a bunch of leaked cables from Saudi Arabia, which show that when the Egyptian revolution, the first one, the real one happened, that kicked out Mubarak and put Morsi into power, the Gulf states were willing to pay $10 billion for Mubarak's release. And Morsi's government was looking very seriously at the office, saying basically there's no benefit to the Egyptian people keeping him in prison. And then, of course, they decided $10 billion was too much money. Let's just go on in with a counter coup, kick Morsi out, sentence him to death, and put our new puppet rulers back in charge of Egypt. And that is how the game gets played. So let's talk a little bit about the economy. The Greek crisis is still out there. No major events, which, of course, is good news for all those sellers of those derivatives against Greece's debt. The new deadline being set by the European Union is 48 hours. There has to be a deal within 48 hours, or they'll extend the deadline again. And this time they really mean it. Now, at this point, the total obligations of the Greek banks to the European Central Bank now exceed the total Greek deposits. Technically, the Greek banks are in a state of default. So, situation is getting real here. Now, Tsipras has made an 11th hour concession saying that he will accept a bailout extension as part of a potential deal. Everybody's trying to come up with some kind of concession that will get this deal made, but there's still a hard line coming from the IMF, the ECB, the Troika. And what they're trying to do is come up with some way to keep this Greek situation ticking along without triggering a derivatives firestorm, but at the same time not making any concessions, which would lead the other member nations of the European Union to stand up and demand exactly the same. So they're in a real corner here. And I don't think the situation has been resolved. They're just basically trying to sweep the whole mess underneath the rug. Now, over in Russia, they're responding to the extension of European sanctions against them, saying, you know, it's not really a problem. The sanctions are creating favorable conditions for Russian industry. Instead of this globalist idea of everybody buying products from these designated zones of production, Russia and all these other nations hit with the sanctions are reinvesting in their own domestic manufacturing and agriculture. And that, of course, is completely contrary to the goal of the New World Order globalists, where they want this nation making only one kind of product and that nation making only another kind of product and this nation over here doing this, so that everybody has to trade with each other across the globe using currency provided by the global central bank and using shipping industries owned by those global bankers to create a system of global dependency. And it's already falling apart. Ron Paul is out there saying that an eventual Sino-Russian currency will have the strength needed to dethrone the dollar. And he's absolutely right about that. Because if you accept currency from Russia or China and you take it back to those countries, you can trade that currency for something of value. Manufactured goods or healthy, organic, natural agricultural produce. Remember, China bans GMO. That's why they're on the one of the reasons they're on the United States Special High Interest Targets list. If you take $1 in trade and you bring it to the United States, what can you get? Faulty ignition switches, GMO food, dangerous medications. Another article we're looking at over in Lou Rockwell. Will the seizure of Russian assets hasten the dollar decline? And they're talking about this lawsuit which resulted in the seizure of Russian assets in France and Belgium, except that Belgium has already reversed course and said, heck with all this stuff, Russia can have their money. They're hedging their bets. They're not convinced NATO can prevail in a potential conflict with Russia. They'd rather be neutral. Very alarming story talking about the number of thrift stores closing across the United States of America. And you know the economy is bad when the thrift stores can't make it. And one of the reasons they can't make it, well, there's two reasons. One, people don't have money to go to any store, thrift or otherwise. Second, thrift stores basically survive on getting used merchandise from the American people. But in this economy, people are hanging on to their appliances. They're wearing their clothes until they're literally falling off their body. They're not buying the new, latest, and greatest and then have the old one to donate to the thrift store. And the thrift stores don't have that much to sell anymore because people are hanging on to products and using them until they're absolutely unusable, at which point they go into the trash. As we already talked about in the phone call, the Senate has advanced the fast-track trade bill for Obama. Obama's out there making words to the... This will be our greatest achievement since Obamacare! Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah! Obama is apparently extending his immigration amnesty to illegals who are already in prison. I mean, this is just absurd. Even some illegal immigrants who've been charged with felonies, but who were released by local authorities, will not be picked up by immigration unless the courts actually convict them, which is going to be kind of hard because they tend not to show up for those court dates. So Obama has unleashed a flood of criminal illegals all across the country at the same time he's insisting law-abiding legal American citizens be disarmed and just rely on the police to keep you safe. And remember, the average wait time for a 911 call here in the United States of America is running 21 minutes. Oh, that's okay. We've got the gun-free zones to keep you safe. That church in Charleston was in a gun-free zone. Yeah, helped them, didn't it? All it did was prevent the victims from being able to fight back against the guy whose brain was melted on Xanax, Suboxone, and a couple of others that are still not yet identified. Now, Trey Gowdy's Benghazi panel has released some of the newest Clinton-Blumenthal emails. They got them from Sidney Blumenthal. And now they're demanding the State Department turn over their copies of them to find out if the State Department had them and didn't share them with the panel, which would indicate obstruction of justice by the White House, or if the State Department never had them to begin with, meaning that Hillary Clinton was obstructing justice, not to mention lying when she said she turned everything over to the State Department. So Trey has played this one beautifully. Somebody somewhere is looking at an obstruction of justice charge, which is rather meaningless if the Department of Justice says, we're not going to prosecute. We didn't prosecute Lois Lerner. We're not going to prosecute these people. We're only going to prosecute the whistleblowers because they're a threat to the national security. Now, there's a public relations company called Crowds on Demand. They provide prepackaged crowds for events, and they are admitting that politicians, candidates like Jeb Bush, are hiring them to come up with a crowd to cheer and scream and clap when they're out there making their campaign promises. Meanwhile, of course, Bernie Sanders is drawing record crowds, and he doesn't need to advertise for them. But those crowds you see cheering behind Hillary and Jeb and Rand are bought and paid for actors. We'll be right back after the news. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 3. The phone lines are open. 877-300-7645. 877-300-7645. Now, up until recently, each branch of the United States military had its own manual of rules for conduct in a conflict zone. The Pentagon decided it was time to have a single manual for all branches of the armed forces, and came out with a new 1,176-page Department of Defense Law of War manual that says when it's right or wrong to kill the enemy. The new rules are it's okay to shoot, explode, bomb, stab, cut the enemy. Surprise attacks and killing retreating troops are permitted, but gas and chemical weapons are forbidden. What's really alarming is the declaration that journalists can be considered as enemy combatants. And by the way, they've changed that word. They've stopped using enemy combatant because of the negative publicity, and now the new term is an unprivileged belligerent. That's the latest euphemism, so they don't actually call them the enemy, at which point treaty obligations regarding conduct in war come into effect. So that's the new word. They're not prisoners of war, they're unprivileged belligerents. In other words, basically saying anybody who doesn't like us that's not covered by the rules of war and the Geneva Convention. That's what they're doing here. And they're basically saying journalists, if they are hostile to the U.S. point of view, will be treated as these unprivileged belligerents, which means we're going to see a lot more reporters and journalists being killed in the war zones. Now, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, Republican of California, was out there on CBS Face the Nation saying that America is dealing with the highest threat level we have ever faced in this country. And he made a point of saying that the threat are young people who are willing to go on that internet, get into the chat rooms, and get radicalized. Bad internet. Bad internet. Okay, well, the reality is, mass marketing companies notwithstanding, people going into chat rooms and on websites don't become radicalized. They get radicalized by seeing the actions of the government before their own eyes. But the U.S. is looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for another excuse to try and impose censorship on the internet to basically make sure that theirs is the only point of view that the American people are exposed to. They don't know how to handle the internet and the independent media. What we're going through right now is a social transformation as dramatic as happened back when Gutenberg rediscovered movable type printing. And all of a sudden, books became affordable to the middle class. Literacy exploded. People were able to self-direct their learning and education. And it was a crisis for the existing power structure, the nobility and the clergy. And they reacted very, very badly. The first English translation of the Bible was burned by the church along with the translator. And in the long run, those institutions that could evolve to adapt to the new reality of not being able to lie to the public on such a grand scale survived. Those institutions that could not evolve to adapt went extinct. We're going through the same thing again today, and I count the United States government as one of those institutions unable to evolve to the new reality because they're carrying the burden of 200 years of lies, fraud, and deceptions that they can't acknowledge without discrediting themselves. And that's why they're trying as hard as they can to drag us back to before the age of movable type printing in the cybernetic sense. And just as it didn't work for Gutenberg, it's not going to work here today. Now, the other day we were talking about how AT&T's been hit with a fine by the FCC for throttling their data on the unlimited data plans. And now it's come out, according to this story over in The Guardian, that all of the major U.S. internet providers are starting to slow down the data delivery rates on their services. And this is supposedly after the FCC introduced the new rules regarding net neutrality, that all data is equal online, to keep ISPs from holding traffic speeds for ransom, and yet the ISPs are doing it. Because after all, they're corporations, and corporations are above the laws of man. Now, we've been seeing the gun grabbers becoming absolutely orgasmic over all those dead bodies in that church in Charleston. They're out there screaming, guns are bad, guns are bad. Now, the British already banned guns. And, of course, crime exploded. And the British government maintained the gun ban with the theory that even though the British people are actually at greater risk of crime, that they believed the propaganda that they were safer, and therefore that was justification to keep the gun ban in place. To give you an idea of how politicians will think. Now, Britain is mounting a campaign against knives. They're calling it Save a Life, Surrender Your Knife. We've got to deal with knife violence. Well, I thought violence was supposed to go away when you banned the guns. Well, those violent people, they went to the knives, so now we've got to ban the knives. And next it'll be beer mugs and cricket bats and all those other things here. Well, you can have my Swiss Army knife when you pry it from my cold, dead fingers. And it really is absurd. And in a way, it's an acknowledgement of one of the basic fallacies of the gun control debate. Taking guns away from the population will not end violence. They'll commit the violence using something else. Baseball bats. broken bottles, cars. That happened the other day. This used to be a nation where the laws punished bad behavior, where it punished the guy who shot somebody, stabbed somebody, ran them over with the car intentionally, beat them to a pulp with a sledgehammer. That was justice. Now we're a nation that bans possessions. Some crazy did bad things with a gun in South Carolina, so all of you have to give up your guns. There have been stabbings following the gun ban, therefore you all have to give up your knives. There have been bludgeonings and axe murders since we confiscated the knives, so now we've got to take away sledgehammers and baseball bats. And by the way, there was actually an attempt to pass a law in California restricting the sale of machetes to state-licensed gardeners and groundskeepers only. That's how crazy they are. Now, there was this story came out of Huffington Post, and it's talking about this California judge who reduced the sentence for a child rapist from 25 years down to 10 on the excuse that raping a 3-year-old is not an intention to harm the child, that this child rapist didn't display particularly violence or callous disregard for the victim's well-being. This is your justice system on drugs. Any questions? I mean, it is just getting ridiculous out there. By the way, we're talking about all these American troops who are now down in Australia, visiting on the aircraft carrier down there, and apparently one of the big attractions down there over in King's Cross is a topless barber shop, where they have topless female barbers, and apparently the reservations for haircuts started pouring in over the email before the carrier ever showed up, and they had to bring additional staff on. So our sailors are having a real good time down there in Australia. We'll be right back. Hello, hi, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, the other day we were talking about how the Monsanto Protection Act is back. Congress is trying to ram through laws that would make it virtually impossible to regulate GMOs in any way in the United States of America, even when the crops are deemed dangerous for consumption. It is a total giveaway to corporate power. It is a hallmark of fascism that government supports the production and sale of harmful products as long as they're making money and the government gets a piece of the action in tax revenues. The government is basically saying you have no right to know if the food you are eating is harmful, even if it actually is harmful. Just eat your slop and be grateful you're eating at all, slave. Now, an illustration of why this is such a bogus piece of legislation, an obvious giveaway to Monsanto, is an incident that happened over in France, where a lamb that was genetically modified to include a jellyfish protein in its biochemistry wound up on the plate at a restaurant. Now, this jellyfish protein is used quite commonly in GMO research to track the presence of the desired genetic modification. It was actually pioneered by a scientist right here in Hawaii who created these glowing mice. They had them on display down here at the museum. I got to see them. Under ultraviolet light, which they cannot be exposed to for very long, the mice would glow with this green glow. And they created this lamb in France to do exactly the same thing. Now, it was a complete accident. The lamb got sold to a meat packing plant and wound up in a restaurant. They're insisting that this jellyfish protein is not harmful to humans, but in France, the sale and consumption of any genetically modified food products for humans is illegal. That, of course, will be rescinded if France signs the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But they're not careful with these products. Now, a lot of people are talking about the shortage of food in this country, the shortage of healthy food. It's a big problem here. And yet, we're looking at this story over at Government Slaves where up in Vermont, a dairy co-op, several dairies working together, dumped 100,000 gallons of perfectly good milk down the sewer to create an artificial shortage to raise the market prices. Now, to me, that is a crime against humanity when you have a country with as many starving, hungry people as we have. If you want to get rid of the 100,000 gallons, ship it to the food banks. Now, down in New Zealand, the argument over raw milk is apparently shifting back toward the natural dairies. New Zealand has now approved raw milk sales and delivery to the people who want it, who don't want all this chemically laden, processed, overcooked, possibly deficient in nutrient value stuff that we get from our stores. So let's talk a little bit about, human-caused global warming. The carbon Nazis are out there cherry-picking data about, oh, they've got this heat wave here, they've got this hot temperature here, oh, see, the place is broiling. Well, they are cherry-picking the data, okay? And the reason we know that is, yeah, there are some hot places on Earth, especially in the middle of all those airports, which is where most of these temperature measurements of 100-degree-plus heat are coming from, because they're surrounded by passenger jets belching out burning kerosene. And it's legitimate to take the temperature at the airport because your pilots need to have that information to figure their takeoff roll, stall speed, and so forth. But it doesn't represent the temperature of the city around that airport. It turns out that the number of days where we have over 100 temperature degrees, or the number of locations, is way, way below normal. Okay? In this month of 1934, half of the United States was over 100 degrees. Half. So far this June, the number of weather stations reporting over 100 degrees is in the single digits. The percentage of U.S. weather stations reaching 100 degrees in June has plummeted over the past several decades. Down in New Zealand, where it's now entering their winter, they just had a huge cold snap. They set all-time temperature records in a lot of their cities. One city came in second behind a record set in 1903. And we're talking about 20 degrees below zero Celsius. That is cold. Now, over in Fort Collins, Colorado, where they're keeping track of climate, they're noticing that our summer seasons are getting shorter. In other words, the spring snows last later, the autumn snows hit earlier, the snow-free season is about a month shorter than it was a century ago. Another article over here from Stephen Goddard. Climate experts claim the hot days in the U.S. are becoming more common due to increased carbon dioxide and human-caused global warming. The raw data shows exactly the opposite. The actual peak for the number of hot days in June was back in 1911 and really started to decline about 1960. Now, a story out of Shooting UK, for those sportsmen still allowed to have access to guns for hunting purposes. Gamekeepers are reporting that the birds have been hit by the cold spring weather. The eggs are not hatching, and the bird populations are being threatened by these cold temperatures, along with a lot of early spring crops, which are being harmed as well. Now, the carbon Nazis are still out there screaming about all this stuff, and up in the CBC, they're talking about how global warming is now a medical emergency, and saying that human-caused global warming could undermine the last 50 years of gains in the development and sale of these new modern health miracles. Well, what's going on here is the reckless practice of selling dangerous and ineffective drugs is catching up with big pharmaceutical corporations. But they're going to drop the blame for all the harmful side effects on human-caused global warming. It's not our fault your kids are autistic or narcoleptic. It's human-caused global warming. Don't blame us. Go on buying our products. Blame those climate deniers. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And boy, it really didn't take long at all for this to start to happen. Remember earlier in the show I was saying Israel is going to throw a tantrum because the Palestinians are taking that United Nations report on Israel's war crimes to the International Criminal Court. And sure enough, a single rocket of undetermined origin flew into northern Israel and, as is normally the case, hit an absolutely empty piece of ground. No injuries, no damage whatsoever. Israel declared that Hamas had to be responsible and has launched airstrikes into Gaza. And, of course, the fact that this rocket hit the ground in Israel tells us one more time that that Iron Dome missile system that was built at U.S. taxpayer expense doesn't really work, does it? It's just another excuse to loot the American people and give the money to Israel. It's amazing. Another story that came in during the commercial break, Russia has now overtaken Saudi Arabia as the top supplier of oil to China. And this is significant because Russia and China do not go through the petrodollar for their energy trade. So this is another hammer blow on the petrodollar arrangement. Now, getting on back to environmentalism and how silly they've gotten. Everybody says, oh, we've got to have electric cars, and the electric cars are clean and non-polluting, forgetting about where the electricity is coming from. Could be even more polluting than an internal combustion engine. It turns out Britain now has twice as many taxpayer-funded electric car charging points as it actually has electric cars. I remember Top Gear did a show about the electric cars, and they made a big deal about, you know, when the battery runs out, you've got no place to plug it into. And Britain is putting in these charging points at taxpayer expense, and they've got more points than they have the electric cars. And I would be in favor of all of this if the electricity were being generated by some environmentally friendly process. But whether you're burning petroleum fuels in your internal combustion engine or you're burning them at the local power station, it's still the same pollution. And by going through the charging battery, uncharging, you're losing efficiency. Every time you convert energy from one form to another, you lose a portion of it. There's no 100% perfect conversion. And the more little steps you put in to get from point A to point B, the less actual energy throughput you get. Now, over in California, Joel Kotkin, a professor at Chapman University, is pointing the finger of blame for the recent water crisis in California on environmentalism. And he's absolutely right, because there is one river that is being allowed to simply flow unmolested into the ocean because environmentalists got a court ruling to protect an endangered species of fish. Now, I'm all in favor of nature, but I'm one of those human beings who think humans have to come first. Human health, human safety, taking care of the humans have to come ahead of the other life forms on this planet. That's why we're the dominant life form. And it is absurd at a time when 2 of California's major aquifers have become contaminated with fracking fluid. The water distribution transport system is leaking millions of gallons of usable water into parts of the desert that don't need it, that the environmentalists are going to say, oh, you have to go without more water because this poor little tiny fish, it can't reach the ocean, it can't breed successfully. I'm sorry, I'm ready for that fish to go extinct. Because life forms do go extinct. We're not doing it. That's just part of nature. And eventually, humans will go extinct. We may help that process along a little bit if we let this war get out of control. Now then, remember, one of the big sticking points about California's water restrictions is the fact that these commercial water bottling companies like Nestle are just sucking water out of the aquifers to put into their little bottles to go on the supermarket shelves. And there's a great deal of waste in the process. For every gallon of water that winds up in the plastic bottles at the supermarket, 2 more gallons get dumped down the drain. And we're being told, well, you should buy your water at the supermarket because the tap water, that's questionable, but that bottled water at the supermarket, that's going to be good for you. It's purified, it tastes good, it's what you want, and yes, it's going to cost more money, but that's really the way you should go. Turns out 14 brands of bottled water have just been recalled over E. coli contamination. The purest, freshest water you can get falls from the sky. And it is now illegal for you to collect that for your own use in most of the states of the Union. That water belongs to the king. It will go down into the ground, and then the water company will suck it back out and put it in a bottle to sell to you. You shouldn't have a right to just catch the rain from the sky. If a corporation can't make profit off of it, it must be declared illegal in the United States of America. Now, here's a good case of organizations being at odds with each other. There is a new study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association that confirms that routine hospital vaccinations of infants are causing damage. Wasn't all that long ago that they said anybody who says vaccines cause any harm at all is a kook and a wacko. They're a vaccine denier and a Holocaust denier and a climate denier, and our vaccines are perfectly safe. But there was a case with a whistleblowing nurse, Michelle Roten, of Nurses Against Mandatory Vaccines, and said she witnessed these perfectly healthy kids getting these 40 vaccines and winding up medically damaged. And the Journal of the American Medical Association has gone in objectively to their credit and said, yeah, there is a body of evidence to support this. And basically it says this mandated infant childhood vaccine schedule, we're talking about babies, 3 or 4 pounds, and they're getting the same amount of vaccines as a 200-pound man because it is profitable. Now, despite this study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the American Medical Association itself still supports the elimination of all parents' rights to decide what vaccines their child will or will not get. So basically what the AMA is saying is, yeah, we know vaccines are going to hurt your kid, but you have to have them anyway. Makes a lot of sense. Now, interestingly enough, Alan Roses, Worldwide Vice President of Genetics at GlaxoSmithKline, no less, said that modern drugs do not work on the majority of patients. Fewer than half the patients prescribed some of the most expensive drugs don't get any benefit because we are all slightly different biochemistries determined by our genetic makeup. And he says a lot of these medications will be given to patients whose DNA are producing enzymes or other chemicals that block the effectiveness of the drugs. They don't work half the time. And it's a recognition that this one-size-fit-all approach to medications, vaccines, doesn't work. It's just good for business. Pharmaceuticals is a $370 billion a year business in the United States of America. We can't let that money slow. The economy will crash without forcing parents to put 40 chemicals in their kids' arm. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our program today, and finishing up on the Journal of the American Medical Association actually publishing a study saying that, yes, there is, in fact, empirical evidence that this massive onslaught of mandated vaccines is permanently harming infants. we need to remember that up until recently, the propaganda from the medical industrial complex was that vaccines are perfectly harmless, they're safe, they're effective, and if the baby is showing signs of illness, it must be the parent's fault. And they came up with shaken baby syndrome. And there is no actual objective measure of shaken baby syndrome. It's a vague description of symptoms which also happen to overlap toxic effects from vaccinations. And this money-driven system has taken innocent parents who have already gone through the trauma of losing their baby and thrown them into prison to protect the profits of the pharmaceutical corporations. How cold and calculating and ruthless and inhuman do you have to be to do that? To take parents who have lost a baby, they've suffered a horrible tragedy, and throw them in prison because you want to protect the profits of the product that actually killed the kid. It's pretty much out there. And I'll tell you, then it gets even worse than that. Not too long ago, we had the story of Rachel Dolezal, who was a leader of a chapter of the NAACP, who was revealed as actually being a white person, although she had, apparently through tanning spray or whatever, posed as a black person for a great many years. And they excused her behavior away by saying, well, she identified with being black, and that made it okay. Because you don't have to be what you were born. If you identify with somebody else, it's perfectly okay to disguise yourself or even resort to surgery. If you are, a woman trapped in a man's body, like Bruce Jenner, it's okay to go in and have things chopped off. Well, I identify with being young, rich, and handsome. I don't think there's a surgical correction for that. But it's getting a little weird out there because the new trans is called transabled. And that is perfectly healthy, functioning people who identify as being disabled. It's a real term. I'm not kidding you. And here's where it gets bizarre. A Canadian university teacher has argued during a radio interview that it is okay for doctors to amputate perfectly healthy limbs from able-bodied, physically healthy individuals who consider themselves transabled. I'm a paraplegic trapped in a perfectly healthy body. Cut my legs off. Sure, okay, does Obamacare cover it? We live in an age where ritual mutilation has returned as a social trend. It's a little bit sick. I had enough of a problem with cosmetic surgery. I mean, any surgery is dangerous. It is harmful to your general overall health. Some surgeries are necessary. I'm not a Christian Scientist. But to undergo surgery just to meet some arbitrary definition of what constitutes beauty, I think it's utter nonsense. And now this is a medical orthodoxy completely out of control. Whatever happened to Hippocrates? First of all, do no harm. Well, there's not enough money in that. If we take a healthy person and send him home without doing anything, we don't make any money off of that. We take a healthy person who wants to live in a wheelchair and we whack his legs up. Well, we get money for that. It's absurd. They're actually talking about this seriously. The transabled. I'm a blind person in a healthy body. Put my eyes out. I'm a deaf person trapped in a healthy body. Whatever. I'm actually a lesbian trapped in a man's body. It's working out so well. Pretty well for me so far here. I mean, it's absurd. It is really absurd out there. This idea that there are people who secretly... You know what it is? It's Munchausen syndrome. People who are healthy, they want to be seen as sick because they get pity and support and sympathy for it. This has taken Munchausen syndrome to an absolute absurd level. Now then, this being summer, you are probably being bombarded by all these commercials for sunscreen products because the sun causes skin cancer and you've got to protect your skin. Actually, you could put a cover-up on, but no. You need to be out there in your Speedos and your bikini and showing off the wonderful body that you got from the health club, and so you've got to slather on all this stuff. Now, it turns out that the sunscreens themselves actually cause more skin cancer than the sun. Overexposure to sun is bad, but there's a very interesting article that appeared in Healing Naturally by Bee saying that the risk of skin cancer from the sun has been way overblown because, and you know this is coming, it helps sell sunscreen products to people. Even people who don't get sunburned will buy the stuff and slather it on. Big floppy hat's actually a lot better for you. It's amazing. Meanwhile, over at the World Health Organization, they have come to the conclusion that an insecticide that's found in head lice treatments in Canada causes non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Now, I wasn't a hippie back in the 60s when being hippie was fashionable, but I'm getting that way in my old age. I am really becoming very leery of all these chemicals, especially after what we went through with Claire and her sensitivities. When it comes to modern products, if I can't pronounce it on the ingredient label, I'm not going to put it in my mouth, I'm not going to put it on my body. Simple is better. I find myself wanting only products made from stuff that's been co-evolving with the human race for millions of years. Because all too often, these synthetically produced chemicals that our bodies have never been exposed to before, we find out after the case they cause damage. And by the way, it's supposed to be a function of our federal government that they find out about these potential harms before the product gets to market. But these days, it's basically launch the product, we'll pay off the lawsuits from the people who get killed by it, and we'll still be making profits. By the way, over in Africa, there's a new outbreak of Ebola in Sierra Leone, and it caught them by surprise. It's only 2 new cases, but it's in the capital city of Freetown. They had about 3 weeks where they weren't seeing any new cases. Now, all of a sudden, it's come back. The other day, there was a big stink all over the net about how somebody had found what looked like a deep-fried rat in a bucket of chicken from Kentucky Fried Chicken. And the picture was certainly convincing. Kentucky Fried Chicken claims to have run DNA tests on this deep-fried rat object and claimed that the DNA says it's just a very, unfortunately, rat-shaped piece of chicken, which I'd be more inclined to believe if somebody other than the corporation had run that DNA test, but that's what they're claiming now. It may look like a rat. Our laboratory test says it actually is a chicken. Now, apparently there is a Reddit competitor called Voat.co has had its PayPal account frozen. PayPal's explanation is that Voat.co violated the acceptable use policy regarding sending and receiving payments for certain sexually oriented materials or services. Now, Voat uses PayPal only to solicit donations. And longtime readers of WhatReallyHappened.com will remember PayPal did exactly the same thing to me to shut off the funding to support this website, which we desperately need. And we got PayPal to back off by pointing out that in point of fact, PayPal does, or did at the time, act as a payment gateway for porn sites, including a child porn site. So, once again, they're out there using the clout of PayPal to silence competitors for their cronies. There's the music. Time for me to get out of here. I got to do Jim Goddard's show. We'll be back tomorrow here on the Genesis Communication Network. Please make a point of calling your local talk radio station. Ask them to program Genesis Communication. Direct them to GCNlive.com. That's GCNlive.com. Thank you for all your help and support. To all you Rivero's Rangers, we'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.